So I thought we'd have a little bit more fun with this video. We're brewing the second batch of Snip Snap, our Citra-Galaxy Double IPA today, and it seemed like a fun opportunity to compare the same beer with the same ingredients, the same recipe, brewed 10 barrels at a time on $150,000 worth of stainless steel, and compare it to my old homebrewing setup. A couple of pots, a few propane burners, nothing too exciting, but you know, the chemistry is the same, the yeast is going to do the same thing, I think. There's certainly some advantages to the big system. We can do closed transfers so no oxygen gets in. We have a little bit more precise control. But really, it's the same basic setup as what I do at home. So, let's get brewing. We have a pretty manual system. I'm lifting the grains by hand, dumping them in as the water sprays in through the spray balls from the hot liquor tank. Mixing that water and the grain together at about the same rate helps to keep the temperature on level. So the homebrew batch, using the same water, same ratio of water treatment, equal amounts calcium sulfate, calcium chloride. We're gonna see how much of the quality of the beer is the equipment and how much is the recipe and the yeast and the ingredients and all that stuff. I took some of the grain from the big batch, used water from the same water filter right from Colombia. So let's see. Mashing in, certainly a little bit of a quicker process. That's all the pale malt. And here goes the rest of the grain. You can see those unmalted flaked oats in there. See the rice hulls, helping to provide some filter media. Just like on the bigger system, the water to grain ratio is about 1.3 quarts per pound. These bigger beers, it's hard to go too wet with the mash just because there's not a lot of room. More water would make it that much more difficult to get everything into one pot. Same ideas on the big scale. We've got a pump recirculating the wort, just bringing those little bits of grain from the bottom under the false bomb up to the top. Helps to make sure the enzymes and the sugars and the starches are all evenly distributed. Sort of automatic stirring. Okay, hour-long recirculation done. Time to start the runoff. Rather than disconnecting and reconnecting a bunch of hoses on this one, I'm just going to move this hose from the diverter, high quality sanitary connection. Okay. Over to the boil kettle. So we're just sparging now. Got a little 170-degree water in this pot right here. This isn't my usual method at home. I actually often just use cold water because I'm lazy, but I figure if we're trying to recreate the process on the big system as closely as possible, I'll do that here. Really the only difference so far in the process, I didn't add any phosphoric acid to this. The amount would have been so small that it would have been more likely to throw off the measurements than anything else. But we're just rinsing out those sugars from the grain, just like on the big system. So I'm scaling this recipe exactly. I'm adding the same amount of hops, Columbus in this case, at the same time. This is one area though that may introduce some variability. Smaller homebrew batches have a tendency to extract less bitterness, just as a simple result of the volume, but also because of different times at temperatures. The cooling will be slower on the big system, so in this case, we'll probably get a little bit less bitterness. There's no sort of, oh boy. Cut that just in time. Almost a boil over. So I've already got my pump going again through the coil of this immersion cooler. So this is going to be one of the sort of major differences between the homebrew scale batch and the big batch. Just naturally, because this batch has so much less total volume, it's going to cool off quicker. So even though I'm not actively cooling it at this point, we're just going to get a quicker drop in temperature, which will lower the isomerization rate. So odds are this beer is going to have a little bit less bitterness than the equivalent big batch. I used the exact same hops. We saved a little bit from each of the bags of Centennial, Columbus, and Cashmere, and we're leaving them in there. So one of the biggest differences between two batches of beer could be the quality of the hops. So we're trying to eliminate that variable here. I think a lot of homebrewers think of hops as really just sort of a commodity, that you've got citrus, you've got Citra, or you've got Cascade, and that all Citra or all Cascade, as long as it's been treated well, is sort of inherently the same. And that's really not true. Just like wine grapes can vary from vineyard to vineyard, hops are going to vary from farm to farm, both in the amount of sun, moisture, all those other things they get, the type of soil, when they're harvested, and even particularly for some of the older varieties, exactly what that strain is. Cascade, Centennial have a lot more variation than Citra or Mosaic or a variety of newer hops. So, just like on the big batch, we're going to let this one whirlpool for about 15 minutes and then settle for about 15 before starting cooling. So after 2 days of brewing and a couple of weeks of waiting and fermentation and dry hopping and all that, I'm here to taste the difference between what is the commercial one and what is the homebrew one. The one on my left, a little bit thicker foam, a little bit better head retention, probably a little bit more carbonated than the one on my right. On the other hand, the one on the right's a little bit paler, a little bit more attractive than the one on the left, which is just a little bit hazier, a little bit duller looking. This is a little bit more of a yellow sheen to it. Pretty similar aromas. The one on the left, let's call this one A, Has a really big saturated hop aroma. It really walks that line between sort of tropical notes and some greener, fresher, grassier kind of notes. Just smells like sticking your nose in a bag of hops. And let's see B. It's a little bit more tropical, a little brighter, a little fruitier, a little bit more of that passion fruit, mango. Both of them have a little bit of that vanilla that we get from our house yeast. I'd give the nod to B. It's just a little bit brighter, fresher, a little less of that green, but really sort of intense, tropical, fruity, juicy kind of aromatics. Now for flavor. Wow, just really saturated with hops. Just from the second it touches your tongue into the aftertaste, it is nothing but delicious, wonderful, saturated, hoppy goodness. Moderate carbonation, good full round body from that chloride and the proteins from the oats and the chit malt. And let's try the other one. Yeah, it's really good. It's really fresh, bright, fruity. Not quite as saturated with the hop flavor. Comes across just a little bit less bitter, but also sort of conversely, it's got just a touch of that hop burn in the throat. When the lupulin glands from hops are in suspension, they can kind of stick in your throat. It's a sign, and it's a good sign for some people that it's a really fresh IPA. But for me, I'd rather have just a little bit of time to drop all that out. While I like haze, I don't necessarily need little bits of the hop itself in suspension. It just gives it sort of a harsh, lingering kind of flavor. Otherwise, though, really nice flavor. It comes across a little bit sweeter, I think, just because of that lower bitterness. They're both really nice beers. You know, to say that you can't brew beer as good as a commercial brewery because you don't have $150,000 worth of stainless steel really just isn't the case. There's certainly something to be said for the control that a commercial brew house gives you, but really most of that money is about making more beer in the same amount of time. I can make 300 gallons of beer on this system in a day and only 10 on my little system. So if I had to guess, I'd say that the one on the right, B, is the small batch version. Temperature didn't stay quite as hot during the whirlpool, so it didn't extract as much bitterness. The flame temperature is a little bit lower because it's trying to boil 10 gallons and not 300 with a direct fire system. Carb's a little bit lower. We used the bright tank to carb up the big one. This one was just had some CO2 shook into it last night by Scott. So I'd say this is the homebrew one, this is commercial. Spencer, what do you think? Yep, got it. So it is the one on the right is the homebrew one. The one on the left is the commercial one. Both of them are really good beers. You know, there really isn't anything that sets this apart as a homebrew except in the comparison that this one had a couple of traits I could pick up having brewed them, knowing that this one was going to be a little bit less bitter, have a little bit you know, more perceived sweetness, and then just sort of the tip off on the carbonation. So hopefully this was a fun experiment. I'm really interested to see what the folks out in the tasting room right now think. If they really pick up that this is a small batch, brewed on my little old home brewing rig versus the one that some of them have had before on the big commercial rig. This is a really fun experiment. Just same malt, same hop, same yeast. Really, the only difference was the equipment. So we'll see. So the results are in, and it turns out I am a better commercial brewer than I am a small batch brewer. We had 49 people try it in the tasting room blind. Each one of them got a 7-ounce pour of each beer and filled out one of these sheets. We ended up with 39 votes for the big batch, A, 9 votes for the little batch, B, and 1 for, quote, which child do you prefer? It seemed like most of the people voting for A picked up on the same sort of 2 things I keyed in on. It had less of that hop burn than B, and also was properly carbonated. Not a lot of sort of hugely, a lot of people just sort of pick their favorite, but a lot of complementary notes. People thought maybe the difference was that there could have been some fruit in B. A couple thought maybe it was lactose. We don't do lactose, but a little bit more body and creaminess. I think probably picking up that higher carbonation and giving it a little bit more of a body and a mouthfeel to it. But yeah, it was a fun experiment. I'm sure we would have gotten probably more accurate or more telling results if we'd done a triangle test, but that's difficult to implement in a sort of tasting room production kind of scale. We're not doing a tasting panel here. But we're planning on doing some more of these experiments, maybe seeing what people prefer between real fruit and fake fruit, maybe comparing some different hops or yeasts, those kinds of things. Just sort of a fun thing for us to do on a Sunday when we don't have much beer left. The initial batch ran out pretty quickly. We only had 1/6 that we'd saved for the comparison. We went through almost 7 barrels of the big batch in about 2.5 days. So apparently the double IPAs are doing well and people are enjoying them. And yeah, that's it from Sapwood Cellars. We'll see you guys next time. Hopefully you can make it in, try the beers, and give us your vote. Cheers.